right, well, hello everybody. I imagine more people are going to pop in from time to time. We also want to greet our guests who are joining us on Facebook Live. I hope that Facebook Live is now up and running. It will be very shortly. So I want to just say good morning, good evening, good afternoon. We're kind of all over the world today, from the west coast of the United States, east coast, in Uganda and Mongolia, as we just said. So it's great to see everybody. Welcome to this special program that we are hosting to commemorate World Mental Health Day. My name is Mick Hirsch, and I'm the executive director of THRIVEGulu. Thrive is a trauma recovery organization that's based in northern Uganda that delivers holistic counseling and economic empowerment and literacy programs to survivors of war, including refugees. And it is my honor to host and moderate a panel discussion that we are calling From Stories of Trauma to Stories of Hope. And this is Thrive's 10-year anniversary. And one of our themes for this occasion has been Your Story Matters. So I'm hoping that today's discussion will help us all better understand why stories and storytelling are therapeutic aids for the healing of mental distress and mental illness. Now, I can't even begin to say, I am beyond thrilled to be joined today by three individuals who are not only leaders in their respective fields, but who are truly among the most exceptional of people. First of all, I'd like to introduce my closest colleague at Thrive, Dora Alal Singhal. She has been the country director at THRIVEGulu for 8 years. Dora holds a bachelor's degree in psychology from Makerere University in Uganda and a master's in development studies from Uganda Martyrs University. She has a certificate in trauma healing from the Center for Victims of Torture and is currently pursuing a diploma in trauma counseling. Dora is a member of the Uganda Counseling Association and the National Mental Health Working Group. She has been an invited speaker at the first mental health conference of the Ugandan National Psychiatric Association and the Coalition to Stop the Use of Child Soldiers that took place a few years back in Nairobi, Kenya. So welcome, Dora. And then the next two individuals are dear friends of mine who I was blessed to meet along the way at different points in my own journey that got me where I am right here today. The first is Dr. Natalie Wigg-Stevenson. She is an associate professor of contextual education and theology at Emmanuel College at the University of Toronto. Is it okay if I refer to both you, Natalie, and Omar by your first names? I just know you. I know you intimately and personally. So if that's okay. So Natalie received her Master of Divinity degree from the Yale Divinity School, and her PhD from her PhD in theological studies from Vanderbilt University in Tennessee. She is an ordained Baptist minister. And Natalie's research explores the intersection between ethnography, culture, identity, decolonizing pedagogies, and theology. She is the author of Ethnographic Theology, an inquiry into the production of theological knowledge, and she co-chairs the group Ecclesial Practices at the American Academy of Religion. And my other dear friend on the call is Dr. Omar Reda. Omar is a psychiatrist with expertise in post-conflict trauma. Omar is a graduate of the Harvard program in refugee trauma, and he attended medical school in his native Libya before resettling in the United States and receiving additional medical training at the University of Tennessee. So there's two Tennessee connections on the call here. Interesting. Omar currently practices at the Providence Healthcare System in Portland, Oregon. He is the founder of Project Untangled, which offers an original methodology to address trauma healing that draws from the power of love, L-O-V-E, listening, options, validation, and empowerment. His innovative approach to working with immigrant and refugee communities includes using poetry and the arts. An example of this is something that he's going to be talking about a little bit later, I hope, is that he is currently an advisor to the forthcoming animated film called Lamia's Poem. So I'd like to welcome all of you to the call. Thank you for being supporters of Thrive, joining us on this, important occasion of World Mental Health Day. And I am looking forward to our conversation here. Once again, I want to welcome the people on who joined us on Zoom, and then especially those on Facebook Live. If you at any time have any questions, you can use the chat box in the Zoom feature, or there is the opportunity just to put in some questions on Facebook that I think we're probably familiar with. So I'm going to begin today with a question for Omar. So Omar, I have just kind of a simple question, but it's very complex, I think. So Omar, why is it so hard to make trauma stop? And what I mean by that is not the actual violence itself. So, not making a war stop or torture stop or even, abuse in a home or family stop. But what I'm referring to is the thing that our shared mentor, Dr. Richard Malika, taught us, and what he refers to as the invisible wounds of trauma. And why is it so hard that those invisible wounds of trauma are so hard to stop for an individual to overcome the trauma that she bears, but also not only for individuals, but also for communities and even, a whole society? So if you can tackle that one, Omar, we'd love to hear what you think.
Thank you very much, Mick. It's really an honor to be with you this morning in Portland, and good afternoon, good evening for everyone. So I agree with you. I mean, we know that trauma has lots of invisible wounds, and when we go to, for example, a refugee camp, or immediately after an armed conflict or an area that's afflicted with a disaster, most of the relief focuses on the physical wounds, the visible, needs, and I highly appreciate that, because we need to take care of the basic needs in the here and now for folks. But many times the suffering will continue if we ignore the big invisible elephant in the room, which is a trauma story that sometimes it will manifest in many other ways, as we know. For children, it can manifest in a behavioral or academic decline. For some of us, as families, it can be a relational, and also for a community or a society. We know that trauma survivors, they can regress. That means they go into an age that's inconsistent with their current chronological age. For example, a child who's traumatized might start to suck their thumbs or bite on their nails, or they want to sleep with their parents, or they become more clingy. When it comes to families, sometimes families, they avoid talking about what happens. They start walking around each other on eggshells, and unfortunately, some families, they even break down because they see each other as the enemy, because the trauma is so much painful and graphic in its details. It's easier for me to just dismiss what happens. And when it comes to society or communities, sometimes they start to see each other as an enemy. They withdraw into their own corners, and they see another person as a hostile or not part of my group. And we see that, unfortunately, very commonly, especially in this time and age when we're threatened. We start to only take care of our small group and see everybody else as an other that needs to be dismissed. Their stories are insignificant, or they are not as significant as our story. And this is very interesting, because I believe every story is significant and every story is worth listening to. So, when it comes to the trauma story itself, I mean, I think it's not only what happens to me, but my interpretation of the stressful event is what makes the stressful event traumatic. So we need just to make sure that people who are bleeding emotionally, we treat them with the same urgency and the same dignity that we treat physical wounds. And I can talk a little bit about stigma and access to, culturally humble resources that can really be barriers towards receiving any kind of services, especially in a country, for example, that has limited resources. That was my example in Libya, when I went to Syria, when I went to Bangladesh to work with the Rohingya refugees running away from the war in Burma. I see the same thing happens over and over. That's why I created Untangled, and I'll be happy to talk about that later.
Excellent, Omar. Thank you so much. You certainly, in just a short minute or two, you really defined how complicated and challenging it is when we're looking at and thinking about and addressing trauma, because as you mentioned, there's so many different dimensions that are taking place. And the one thing that you said that really hit me was when a child is traumatized, that child may revert back to an age that is much different from what she actually is and start sucking her thumb or something. And that's very interesting. But one thing I'd love it if you could kind of unpack even a little bit more is, you said that when it comes to our trauma story, that it's not only about what happens to me or what happened to me, but it's also my interpretation of that. And I think that that's really powerful, because a lot of times I think with trauma, it's not even the reality so much. It's how you recreate that reality that is part of that invisible wound that you bear. And then I also think you started to talk about stigma. You mentioned that word stigma. And I think it's important because the trauma story is not just about what happens to me, but it's also, I would think, how I interpret it, but it's also how other people interpret what happens to me. So could you talk just a little bit maybe about that, especially the stigma piece?
Yeah, thank you. So you're absolutely right, So for example, when it comes to something that happens to me, which is a traumatic event, I can have different ways to cope with my trauma. I can internalize what happens to me, and I say, because I am fundamentally a person who is not good, or a person who deserves to be violated, or I start to talk to myself in a self-loathing language that's really usually unhelpful for my psyche. It can lead to decline in my self-esteem, and will affect my identity and stuff like that. And imagine if this is like a child, and we know for children to grow to be healthy adults, they need mainly two things. One, they need the core belief that the world is a safe place, and they also need to believe and trust that adults can be trusted to care for them. So if the world is unsafe, because there are different kinds of trauma, and if that trauma is caused by a trusted adult, either in a form of abuse or neglect or interpersonal violence, these core beliefs will get shattered. And unless we find ways for children to regain that sense of safety, and give them platforms to start to tell their story in a way that makes meaning possible, it will be coherent for them, it will give them sense of closure, and eventually they find the beauty. Even when, and Dr. Mulika loves to focus on the beauty of what happens, don't only dig into the graphic details of the trauma, but also know that people have resilience, they have coping skills, and they usually heal in a relational context. That's why it will be wonderful if a stigma can be reduced or eliminated. And we do that through education, so we can increase the mental health literacy of the community we're working with. Because it is very, very unfortunate when people are suffering alone and suffering in silence, and they're crying themselves to sleep, and there are broken hearts behind closed doors. And This is really very unfortunate because, you know, everybody is trying their best given their circumstances. Every parent, every caregiver, they try to really care for the children. But in a way, I notice, especially with the refugee community, I notice that they focus more on the materialistic needs and they kind of neglect the emotional needs. This can be because of culture, it can be because of conflicting pressures, trying to chase the American dream. And what's the American dream if it's not my family? So in a way, they are losing the American dream chasing it. So that's why I'm, you know, very heavy on trying to focus on family bonding, give children ways to empower them and give them a voice. Because if people are narrating your story for you, you might grow up believing it.
Thank you, thank you, Omar. Those are both very powerful. You know, what is the American dream if not my family? And if you let someone else narrate your dream for you, you might grow up believing it. So those are some very powerful, you know, just ideas that I think we can hold on to, and hopefully we can come back to some of them. And in fact, I'd kind of like to transition just a little bit from this you know, continuing narrative or understanding of story, and ask Natalie a question. So Natalie, we've just heard now from Omar about, you know, how complicated, and you know, another term for complicated is complex trauma can be. But you know, we at Thrive, just if I can just mention a thing or two about our organization. So Thrive recognizes that more often than not, trauma is complex. And what we mean by complex trauma is what I often say when I address gatherings like this, and when I talk about our organization, I say that, you know, it's hard to stop being stressed and depressed when you live in abject poverty. But it's also hard to hold a job or start a small business when you've been denied an education. And so all of these kind of multiple traumas add up, I think, and that's what complex trauma is. So at Thrive, we offer an approach to trauma recovery that includes economic empowerment and literacy right alongside our counseling services. But what I'd like you to maybe talk about is that I think there's another kind of trauma that too often gets overlooked. But it's very important, I think, and it adds to this complex trauma. And what I'm thinking of is that it seems to me like perpetrators of violence, especially on a large scale, but not always, sometimes, you know, even on a smaller scale, but especially on a large scale, that perpetrators will often use culture and religion as weapons of war. And that they basically take control of the stories. You know, a lot of like what Omar just said, you know, if someone takes control of your narrative, you end up believing it. So they take control of the stories and they rewrite them. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit with your background and expertise in culture and identity, and just talk about what happens to a person and to a society when a culture is stripped away or, you know, effaced. Can you talk a little bit about that one?
Yeah, thanks. First of all, Mick, thanks so much for having me. It's an honor to be a part of this illustrious group. This is such an important question, right? So I think there's two sides here. There's the violence that's done when someone's culture or religious practice is taken away as an act of violence. And then the issue of when a particular cultural practice or religious practice is then imposed upon a person or a particular population. So I'm in the Canadian context. I live in Toronto. And so for us, a pressing issue is trying to think about the history of colonization in Canada and how that impacts the current situation for the relationship between Indigenous people and what we would call settlers in the Canadian context. And so we've gone through a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which has been a multi-year event of storytelling, truth for Indigenous people who were removed from their homes and put into and then abused within residential schools. And then we are far, far away from reconciliation in light of the horror of those stories we've heard. But one of the things we really tend to notice is that it's not so simple as saying historically, someone's family has had their spiritual traditions, their cultural traditions taken away from them. We call this cultural genocide in our context. It's not just simple. You can't say the simple thing of, okay, so now what we need to do is strip away the imposed religious practices, say, that the Christian missionaries brought, and just return to these other traditional practices. Because now we have people in our context for whom the sacred is shaped both by the traditions that were taken away and by the ones that were imposed upon them. And so the very mechanisms of their trauma also need somehow to become the resources of their healing. And so the complexity of the issue of the yearning for traditional ways, the ways in which those have been violently removed, stamped out, hidden, and then carried in the bodies of people through generations into the present time, and then also for many people feeling the lure or the comfort of religious practices that are foreign to other people in their communities, right? So there's this need for community-based healing, while at the same time an alienation from one's community. And so all these pieces come together in a very complex configuration that, frankly, I think it could take more than a lifetime to find full healing for. And yet, again, all contain the resources for resilience in the face of that trauma. But it's different than a Western psychotherapeutic model of the self, right? The community, relationality, all those pieces play an important part in how people who've been traumatized by colonization experience that trauma.
Well, thank you so much, Natalie. That's really fascinating, and what an interesting perspective. Like you said, it is a very different one than how we often think about kind of our traditional Western psychotherapy. And this is something that maybe Dora can also get into a little bit in talking about the Ugandan context, because you're absolutely right. The imposition of ideas into a place where they don't naturally emerge, that they're not natural, they're not from that earth, not necessarily referring to space or anything, but is really interesting and complicated. And like you said, this is something that becomes kind of embodied into an entire people. And sometimes I have a hard time even kind of understanding that kind of embodiment of we talk about embodied trauma. Could you talk just a little bit more about, because I think that word is really interesting with regards to all of this, is how these acts that are kind of aggressively and forcefully placed upon a person and a people, how it becomes embodied in who they are.
Well, I would point to what you just said, Mick, of it. It's not just about the land or the space. In our context, it's very much about the land and the space. And so spiritual practices for at least most of the First Nations in Canada would have a deep integration with land in a way that I think, Westerners simply cannot understand. It's not about ownership of the land. It's a integrative caretaking relationship with the land. The spirit is in the earth. So there's a lot going on there that colonization just can break that very holistic relationship of creation for people. And so people who in their own traditional practices are formed through generations of relationship to the land, and then have that cut off from them. That's just not how Westerners think about trauma. Trauma for us is more of a single event that then someone needs to learn how to make meaning out of and narrate through life. Narrative is very different for people who have been colonized. It's a separation from multiple modes of meaning making across time that gets, we're increasingly coming to understand how trauma is carried, in our bodies, in our genetic makeup, and passed from generation to generation. And so when you have generational trauma through colonization, that begins to be carried in the bodies of people who are living now. They're carrying things from their ancestors across time. Western psychotherapy is beginning to catch up to something that, Indigenous people have known for a long time. The presence of the ancestors is really important. When people get cut off from that, there's an immense loss of self that takes place there, and a cutting off of the resources for healing.
Wow, that's all absolutely fascinating, Natalie. Thank you so much for bringing that perspective. That's something that I myself, as someone who engages in the healing process in the throughout different places in the world, but especially now in Uganda, I can learn so much more about that. And so, thank you. It's really a big reminder of who we are as humans, and the things that really make us who we are, and help us to better engage others. So thank you so much for that. Dora, I want to turn to you now as the resident expert on the post-conflict situation in northern Uganda, in the aftermath of the war that was perpetrated by Joseph Kony and the Lord's Resistance Army. And I really want to just ask you, again, it may sound like a simple question, but why is an organization like THRIVEGulu still needed? So in kind of light about, what Omar and Natalie have just been talking about with regards to trauma and complex trauma, and how it works, and how it's individual but communal and everything. What are the unique challenges that northern Uganda continues to face even over a decade after the official end of the war?
Thank you, and welcome all our viewers this morning, afternoon, evening. And thank you, Mick. Just speaking from Omar emphasizing just not what happened to an individual, but the interpretation of each of the events. And for northern Uganda, in the context of the NRA war that has been here, individuals suffered multiple events at different points in their life. And the sufferings were over 20 years. And so, adding on what Natalie said, already the community we are in are suffering from intergenerational trauma that is being passed on, and still continuing to be passed on. So healing in northern Uganda is still going to require some time, but also a lot more work than what has been happening. I like the way Omar put it, and that is usually the case, that in the crisis moment, a lot of the focus is focused on the physical need, and the psychological and emotional needs kind of, bare minimum, really. I worked in 2 rehabilitation centers before I came to Thrive. So I'm a testimony to that. And that means, even as we talk about people reintegrating back into their communities, resettling back into their communities, they're moving with the trauma that is not resolved. And that is the cause of what we now experience in northern Uganda, the increased violence happening at family levels, the increased suicide happening within the communities, the increased unlawfulness happening within the communities. So it will still take us a lot more time, and organizations like Thrive that is tackling to fight trauma, to fight stigma, still has a lot of work to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Dora. Yes, I think you do a good job of saying that we still have a lot to do, and that's precisely why our organization, I think, is very important, because it's just not what we would call a quick fix. That's not going to happen. One thing that you did mention that I think is really interesting is how, you know, even if you kind of help to rehabilitate a person, if you try to then reintegrate them into a context that hasn't been healed itself, that is still struggling itself with traumatic wounds, and with all of these other complex traumatic things like poverty and whatnot, it's still going to be very hard for them to pick up and thrive in this life. So it's certainly not easy, because there's multiple parts that are at play. And when I was mentioning earlier that Thrive does a holistic approach, and that we do try to take into account the interaction of mental health and economic health and education and all of these things, it's a complex problem that we have. But thank you for sharing a little bit about what we do. So I want to now just move on to a little shift in our direction. So far in this conversation, we've been focusing mainly on the challenges that we face, and you know how hard it is to address some of these problems of mental health, and you know that these are long-term issues. But I also want to take a look at innovations and solutions and potential strategies, because there are a lot of really good and interesting things that are taking place out there in the world that are giving us a lot of hope for a better future. And one person who I think is doing just amazing things in this area, and we're so lucky to have on this call today, is Omar. Because Omar's work with the trauma story that he's already kind of introduced a little bit is so unique, because he's really taking the trauma story and trying to use it as a healing tool, as an aid. So he mentioned earlier about how, you know, it's not just about your trauma, but it's how you interpret it. But that it can also be about how other people interpret it, and that if someone else takes a hold of that story, that trauma story, they can use it against you, and it can hurt you. But instead, what Omar tries to do is help the person, I think, recognize, you know, listen to that trauma story and recognize signs of resiliency and other things in it, so that they can use it as a healing aid. So Omar, I'd like you to maybe talk a little bit more about that trauma story and how it can be healing, and then also talk, maybe if you can, a little bit about that exciting project that I referred to earlier.
Well, thank you, Mick. It's really impressive, you know, how I'm hearing these wonderful, you know, projects going on, and like, you know, it's amazing you guys are focusing on housing and employment and education, because many people think it's only, you know, the psychological aspects, and you know, let me just do a session with my client and then send them on their way. But like Natalie said, you know, people are searching for meaning. There are memories that are attached to, you know, what we call home. For me, when I left Libya, Libya did not leave me, you know, and when I go back and forth to, you know, refugee camps, I don't come back as a whole person. I leave a piece of my heart behind, because, you know, you're leaving all of these beautiful children, and, you know, that they are going on through a dysfunctional cycle that sometimes, if we don't break it, it will lead to lots of unfortunate, you know, consequences. So that's why I created Untangled, because I wanted to tangle folks and families and communities who are otherwise, in a deadly web, and they can repeat a cycle that usually, hopefully, we can together try to break it. And that's why, like Dr. Mulika, he emphasized that that has a new model, the 5 or H5, the model of having focus on housing, but also healing through the trauma story. Also, we need to focus on the habitat, our relationship with the land, also focusing on humiliation and making sure that we regain that sense of dignity for folks. So my love to do that is with the children, through recreating their story in a way that makes meaning to them. And of course, the children don't live in a bubble. They are living under the care of adults. So very briefly, if I can share my screen and show what Untangled is about in a cultural, context. So this is briefly some of the things that I try to do with the communities that I go to. Of course, I don't go to a refugee camp as an expert that I know it all. I try to be very culturally humble. So before I fly in, I will ask what are the current needs, the current services, and what are the gaps. And I try to fill any gaps through education or training or raising capacity or building resources for the community. So focusing on parenting, for example, you can see there are workshops happening here in Oregon, but also in the Cox's Bazar refugee camps where the Rohingya refugees are. So we try to reestablish safety in the household, try to make sure there is bonding between parents and their children. We also try to focus on the relationship between spouses. So we call these with very benign names. We don't invite people to the psychosocial event. This one was called, Will You Remarry Me? So I actually, after this seminar, I posed that question to my wife. I'm like, are you going to remarry me? And she's like, I'm going to think about it. So these are like some of the events that we do both here in the US, but also in any context that we go to. I love working with the children. So these are trauma-informed camps and retreats that we take refugee and immigrant children on. Usually they are technology free, believe it or not. And these teenagers and young children, they love the connection that they have between each other, connection to themselves, connection to nature, and a high power of their choice. You can see the beautiful children of Bangladesh also doing a little bit of that. And, whenever the community needs, we can maybe open a clinic or help them with the establishing a mobile crisis team or response hotline, whatever it is that the community needs. So we don't just go and do one event and then nothing happens after that. We try to have long-term projects and have a relationship with the community through consultation or supervision or whatever it is. Out of that, many books came out, like On the Shoulders of the Prophet. And like in my religion, one of the very safe role models was the Prophet of Islam. And he was so safe that the children came and climbed on his shoulders. So the first book was On the Shoulders of the Prophet. If you don't have a trusted caregiver that gives you safety, you might find safety in deviant ideologies and dark extremist groups. So my second book was Generation of ISIS. My most recent book was Untangled, where I try to focus on the relationship between family members, because a trauma can suck the joy out of a family and can actually make people go voiceless because they don't have the words for what happened to them. I love doing interfaith, dialogue. So I wrote chapters on the book of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism as a psychiatrist. And you can see Untangled is not only about, the horrible trauma that happens. You can see there is lots of destruction behind the lady who's walking away from Syria, but there is still a little bit of hope trying to plant that flower in her new land. And this is why I got involved with Lamia's poem. This is a young Syrian child who's fleeing her country. But before she left the country, her teacher gave her a book by Rumi. And Rumi is a very famous and wonderful poet who basically said that the wound is the place where the light enters you. He reminded the child that there are beautiful things that you can only see in the dark. So out of the darkness, you can see the beauty of full moon, shining stars, fireflies, fireworks. But you can also hopefully find a meaning, find healing, find joy, find connection. And this is my trauma story, or part of it. These are three beautiful people. My sister, who died of brain cancer when she was only 14. And she's the reason I pursued medicine and I became a physician. I thought I'm going to become a brain surgeon, but every time I go to the OR, I faint. So they told me you cannot be a brain surgeon if you're always unconscious. So I found my passion in psychiatry. And then my nephew, he died, killed by ISIS in 2014. And this is an extremist group, decided to leave his 1-year-old child an orphan, unfortunately. And then my mom, who I recently lost, and she's the reason that I do this work. She always reminded me to find beauty and try to be a source of healing for others.
Wow, thank you so much, Omar, for that kind of personal but very powerful and I mean just a testimony to so many things about human resiliency and hope and looking forward. That picture that you showed of the woman, the kind of cartoon picture with the woman next to your Untitled, leaving Syria with so much destruction behind her, and yet she's holding those flowers and the hope that that might present. And then this Lamya's poem project that you're working on, which I can't wait to really see, and when it's fully complete. I love the idea that you're using Rumi, the great Persian poet, and as a powerful healing tool because the words are beauty, and trying to encourage people to find that beauty that will always be in them, because we are innately beautiful people, and we have so much beauty then that to shine forth, and so I thank you for sharing all of that with us. Wonderful lessons to be learned, regardless of whether we're mental health practitioners or just people who care about our fellow people throughout the world. Natalie, let's turn to you and kind of return to some of the conversation we were having earlier, which was, I found it just challenged me so much, because it really opens my mind to so many new ways of thinking. Can you just talk about, so drawing from where we kind of left off with the challenges of cultural genocide and some of these really, really painful situations that people are faced with. How do people then begin to make meaning of their lives again? How do they begin to reclaim their identity, and what is the hope? What does the future hope look like?
Yeah, so when we were talking before about the complexity of how trauma enters a person's body and community, when it's through sort of war-based, violent, colonial, generational forms of trauma, we mentioned that there's just such an intense complexity to all the pieces that interweave in that experience beyond just the individual's experience. And the flip side to that then is, of course, there's this very entangled, to echo Omar's language, entangled web of resources that people have to draw on as well. So as Omar was pointing out, so this kind of work that can be done beyond that one-on-one counseling session, right? Those are crucial, but in addition to those, there's so the meaning making doesn't have to be sort of looking back on a traumatic event and trying to re-narrate that. Meaning making can come throughout the entire realm of a person's life. It's beginning to try to figure out how to integrate disparate parts of self. So we talked before about the loss and imposition of culture and religion, right? A path of healing can begin to be integrating those pieces through the practices of everyday life. And this is where, again, as Omar is pointing out, the use of the arts, narrative, poetry, spirituality, I would add dance, bodily movement, yoga, massage, anything that can release trauma from the body. All of these practices become the potential for healing of an individual, but then because of this networked relationality through which trauma has taken place, the healing of an individual can also spread to the healing of a community. When healing becomes community-based, then people are healing each other through their shared negotiation of trying to unpack, live with, reimagine, and re-narrate the trauma that they've experienced together. And then the healing becomes grounded just in the practices of everyday life outside of that one-on-one counseling relationship too.
That's fascinating, Natalie, and I'm so glad you mentioned dance because Thrive is actually really excited. I'm going to boast a little bit here because just 2 weeks ago we were awarded a grant by an organization from the UK called Comic Relief, and the purpose of the grant is to integrate dance, body movement with a mental health recovery project to try to improve the mental health outcomes of survivors of conflict. And so for the first time, we've never done anything like this with Thrive, but we put forth a proposal kind of anticipating this kind of thing that you're talking about, but we're still very new with it. So we kind of had an idea that, wow, just as you've mentioned, this, if we can kind of bring people together and get them using some of their traditional dance forms and then for some of the youth using, some more kind of modern hip hop forms, but still things that are going to get them interacting in a different level, in a different kind of way, that has multiple benefits, including health benefits and everything, but really hope that the outcome can be that exactly this, that you're healing the community. And then when you heal, when healing becomes community-based, then people are healing each other. So, I think that that's really powerful. So I'm really glad you mentioned that one. Is that something that is that something that you've seen being practiced at all in your work in Canada or anywhere else?
Yeah, I've seen it practiced in a number of different ways, but I think one of the most powerful experiences I've had with this is, I mentioned in the Canadian context, we are failing at, but nevertheless seeking a path to reconciliation between Indigenous people and those of us we would call settlers, so those of us who benefit from the colonial legacy and contemporary practices of colonialism in Canada. And a place that I saw this just practiced in such a beautiful way was attending a reconciliation retreat where Indigenous people and settlers who were from the same sort of land area, it's a contested land area for who, well, it's a longer story, but it's a contested land area. So we gathered on that land and had a couple of days of talking about what reconciliation would look like. And that was the head stuff. We're talking about what reconciliation looked like, but it closed with a traditional, very local form of ring dancing. And everyone did the dancing together. And it was led in a very culturally appropriate way by the First Nations people, Six Nations in this context, who were leading it. But then those of us who were settlers got to join. And so we were under their leadership, dancing together into this sort of beautiful ecstatic practice that begins, I think, to, if not heal, begins to give us these glimpses of what healing might look like. So, I mean, that's very different than, say, the trauma experienced by an individual or a particular community. This now is then the attempt of different people from across cultural differences trying to come together and enact something that, it seems to me in many cases, it's the physical that does that best of all, to share this shared bodily experience where we're trying to figure out together what healing might look like in our country.
Okay, sorry, I think I was muted there for a second. Wow, wonderful. That's a great example and something that really gives me encouragement and hope. And I'm really excited about this project that'll start next calendar year. And yeah, we're it's a pilot project. It's 2 years, and so we're going to kind of see. But Natalie, don't be surprised if I consult with you on some of these greater issues. So thank you. I know we're starting to run a little bit out of time, so I want to just I want to just turn back to Dora. And Dora, I had a number of other questions that I wanted to pose to you, but in lieu of time, or given the time, I think I want to ask you to really just talk about your experience, since we're doing really good here with the story theme, your experience as being one of the very first trained psychologists to support the rehabilitation and reintegration of the former child soldiers and child brides back into society after they had returned from the bush. So you've been there since the beginning of that, over more than 10 years now. How have you been able to identify changes in how people kind of spoke about themselves, spoke about their experiences, their stories, how they used those narratives from over the course of time, from the beginning when you first started talking with some of these individuals as they returned, to now when they've had the opportunity to receive some support services from organizations like Thrive? Can you talk a little bit about kind of that development?
Thank you, viewers, once again. I just want to say a quick one that THRIVEGulu believes so much in storytelling, and that is like our core. And this was ordinarily thought about by Professor Judy Dusko, our president and founder for Thrive, but also in line with our culture and tradition here in Uganda and northern Uganda, that people need to talk, and many times they do not have anyone to talk to. So Thrive comes in to bridge the gap. Before I came to work for Thrive in January 2012, I worked in 2 large rehabilitation centers receiving children who were returning from the LRA captivity at those points directly. Receiving the children, I worked more with the children's center. I also worked at the children's center with the child mothers who were forcefully taken and given as wives to the LRA commanders and returned with babies. And as I said earlier, the work we do at Thrive is building up and strengthening the work that is started at the rehabilitation centers. The reintegration processes are happening in the communities, and that is where Thrive now is providing our community-based mental health services. Our understanding this evening and morning in the complexities of trauma tells each one of us that it is not true that the work that was done at the rehabilitation centers were enough to deal with the trauma or to help individuals deal with the multiple traumas they've suffered. So our work at Thrive continues to build on this. And of course, for the many communities we continue to interface with, some of the people we serve at Thrive are some of the people I have served previously in the different rehabilitation centers, especially the child mothers who returned with children, the other children who were critically injured and had complications, and some of them now have physical disabilities. Through our Thrivers empowerment groups, the stories have changed, definitely. As the women come together and meet every week, they see each other, that is already part of healing. They have opportunity to talk amongst themselves, that is already a part of healing. They come and save their little money together, and they're able to, divide that resources to help them meet their basic need, that is already healing. Of course, with our counselors and our empowerment teams, continuing to work with them to provide education. Already Omar talked about the stigma that is attached to trauma. So we do a lot of education around stigma. We do a lot of education around the general mental health conditions because people do not have information. And linking back to what Natalie has said, that here people say mental health is caused by witchcraft. So they link it back to the spirits. So it is our task to continue to educate them to understand that mental health conditions are, conditions that have treatment and that they can heal. We use the power of talk therapy so much in all the work that we do. And for those of us who have mental health background, we know that the talk therapy is one of the treatment that is used to treat wide range of mental health conditions. If you look at the different approaches we have, the cognitive behavior therapy, the net therapy, when you look at all those range of approaches, it is about talking. It is about allowing the individuals to tell their stories. And I just like the way Omar put it, that, it is not just the story, but it is how the individual interprets the story. So that is why in cognitive behavior therapy, we work more to help them to refocus their thinking, that no, that is not realistic. Why? Who said that? We challenge their thinking ability, their negative cognition, so that they can refocus in life. And so I feel so proud when I look back and I see the range of work I have done from the rehabilitation centers to now the work I am doing in Thrive. Recently, one of the child mothers called me and said, "Madam, I am having a birthday for my child, and I thought you would join us." And I laughed on phone. But later on, when I was reflecting, I said, "Oh yes, so these women who are so vulnerable are now so powerful that they even spare money for birthday parties. Sure, they can now afford to hold birthday parties for their children." I think for me, this was very fulfilling and very rewarding. And when I see our women, when I meet them, the way they're dressed, the way they talk with a level of confidence, they have a focus. This morning, I was in our bank here, and one of the ladies from our group said she came to me to help her write for her deposit slip to deposit money in her bank account. And then she came back and said, "But madam, I have also bought a 2-acre piece of land, and during the dry season, I'll be working on it." I felt so fulfilled. And I said, "Oh yes, this is where we want you to be." She still shared with me challenges now that compounds the issue of trauma not easily going. She's now a mother with adolescent children, teen children, and all of us who have teen children in our homes, we know the challenges that they come with. So she still goes through those challenges, but she's not bringing those challenges for counseling anymore. She has built her capacity to know that these challenges will exist, but she's able to respond to them appropriately and support herself. Mick, I want to say for Thrive, for the last 8 years I have served and seen the growth. We have 28 local staffs. So we are providing employment opportunity for our children here. We have 12 professional counselors working with us. Our approach for community-based mental health has been more fulfilling and more satisfying to the community. Our approach of integrated approach has been very powerful to support our communities in their needs. Our support, our approaches of complaints and feedback mechanisms that we continuously enforce has been very powerful. So we keep on track with the communities. We get their feedback, we improve our program. When we are applying for any grants, we are able to go in with their inputs. I want to say thank you so much. I know that this time has been short, but I believe that we will continue to have these discussions going on. I want to take this opportunity to say thank you to all those who support our good work in northern Uganda and with the refugees now in Palabek. I also want to say thank you to our friends and colleagues and our donors and our board members in the US. Please, this year's theme for World Mental Health Day, we are saying invest in mental health. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you, Dora. Thank you so much for sharing some more insight into the situation in northern Uganda, the history. You're a great historian and archivist of information. And as you mentioned, and you're very humble with regards to it, but you've done so much for the people of northern Uganda in terms of the healing process. And when you're able to tell a story about a young mother who's able to throw a birthday party for her child, you know, having been to northern Uganda and known the people there, the fact that they're able to do that is a cause for celebration the world over, because that's a very special thing. And you know, I can only hope and pray that mothers throughout the world would have that joy to be able to do something like that for their child. It may not seem like a whole lot for us in the United States, but for a context like ours in Uganda, that's a big special thing. So thank you for sharing that story. I know we're already kind of over time, so we've had a few comments that people have thrown out, and I thank you for those. And you know, certainly it's important to think about. You know, one of my friends here too said that we want to accept that people have the right to be upset. Absolutely, you know, we need to let people have that, but at the same time, we do need to redirect those emotions for a positive outcome. I think that that's a very key insight into any kind of reconciliation as well. We want to let people express themselves, but in a way that ultimately can be somewhat positive for all. And Toddy, another friend of mine, asked about helping to increase the understanding of what the root causes of the violence or what the conflicts may be. And Omar responded to that one and said, yeah, that most of the time that may be something that could be, you know, a healing thing for us. So lots of things on there. I thank you for all of those. I want to just myself say thank you again to our three panelists. I want to say thank you so much to Dora. Dora, I get to talk with you regularly, but I always enjoy our conversations and hearing from you. I learn from you every day. I've missed the fact that I can't be in Uganda to spend time with you and the team, but I know some of our team is on the call, and one of our board members from Uganda is on the call as well. So thank you for that. And then Omar, I want to thank you. Great to see you. You know, it was wonderful learning alongside of you. Oh wow, that was over a decade ago. Learning alongside of you at the Harvard program in refugee trauma, and now learning alongside of you again. Although now you are my teacher, so thank you for that. You're wonderful. I appreciate all that you have to bring to the conversation. So thank you, Omar. Natalie, you too have become my teacher. I've learned so much from you today. I thank you. I can't even begin to tell you the perspectives that you brought. Have really just kind of all these aha moments that are going on in my brain right now. So thank you for that. I also want to thank my colleagues Anita Stetson and Laura McBride. They were fabulous in pulling together this program. Laura is our communications director, And Anita is our operations director. They've been behind the scenes making all of this work, sending out emails, reminding people, doing the Facebook Live, and then doing this Zoom. So thank you, Anita and Laura, both for that. Also, thanks to Jacob, our media specialist in Uganda, for helping out Dora today. I want to just invite, if he is willing, our board member Eric, who introduced himself earlier. And Eric, if you want to just say a word or two, just to kind of conclude and you know, just kind of wrap it all up for us, that would be so much appreciated.
Yeah, and you've also given me another assignment, I know. So let me just say, this has been a tremendous learning experience for me, and a really nice way to spend, even though it's gorgeous here in Western Massachusetts. It's been a nice hour plus to spend indoors, and it's caused me to reflect on work I've done in South Africa, in Rwanda, and in northern Uganda, and I credit Thrive for broadening my view to grasp the phrase that Omar used. I think he was quoting someone else, the invisible wounds of trauma, and to add that to my own menu of literacy, employment development, and youth development. So the assignment that I have, I must say, is to be a fundraiser closer. We are all practitioners and scholars here. We are not, any of us, very good at asking, especially our colleagues, for money. So let me just confess that I've put a little bit of money where my mouth is. I learned very early of the phrase, give till it hurts, and I never liked that very much. So I suggest an alternative, which is that we, even as professionals and practitioners, give till it matters. And in that context, I don't have a lot of money. Nobody here is rolling in money, I suspect, unless you inherited it. But I have committed $2,000 as a matching fund. And it is my assignment to ask you and anyone you know to give until it matters. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Eric. You are so elegant in being able to do something that is very difficult for many of us to do or even imagine doing. And I thank you for your generosity, your many, many years of service, the countless lives that you've touched around the world, especially in Africa and the global South, as you said. And you continue to do that as a board member on THRIVEGulu, and we are blessed to have you. Thank you for all that you do. Thank you for bringing this to a close, and for really the call to action that that what we have, what little it is, it does matter, and we can put it to a good use if we find the right place to put it. And I thank you for giving $2,000 of your dollars to this organization to help us continue to further the cause of world mental health, so that we can just do the good work that I believe in, that you believe in, and that all of us here are in one way or another participating in. So thank you all for being here today. May you have a good day, a good afternoon, evening, sleep, whatever. We will keep in touch with you because you are our friends, you are our allies, and you are advocates for literally 1 billion people the world over who struggle with mental illness on a day in and day out basis. Thank you all. Have a good one. Bye.
Thank you.